When a nation becomes a drug dealer, imagine a corporate supergiant, a company so valuable that even today, it would make Apple, Google, and Saudi Aramco look like roadside stalls. It had its own private army, which was larger than the standing armies of most nations at the time. It possessed the right to mint currency. It even exercised administrative power, ruling over hundreds of millions of people. But this company faced a devastating problem. Its core business, textiles, had completely failed in the Chinese market. Warehouses were overflowing, cash flow was drying up, and its shareholders, namely the British government and aristocracy, were pounding the table, demanding dividends. If this company were Amazon today, it might lay off workers or optimize algorithms. But this company lived in the year 1839. Its name was the British East India Company. Facing bankruptcy, it made what may be the most immoral, yet profitable pivot in business history. It decided to become the world's largest drug dealer. This is not a story about a clash of civilizations, nor the hollow textbook slogan that backward nations get beaten. This is a story about money. It is the story of how the world's largest empire fell into a fiscal crisis because it could not afford tea, and how, to balance its books, it transformed itself into an armed narcotics syndicate, ultimately forcing another civilization into addiction through war. Welcome to the real ledger of the Opium War. Forget the war, look at the balance sheet. To understand the Opium War, you must first forget the word war and examine the British balance sheet. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain had developed a severe addiction, not to drugs but to tea. In London salons, Manchester factories, and Scottish farmhouses, tea was more than a beverage, it was the lubricant of the Industrial Revolution. For factory owners, sweetened black tea with its caffeine was cheap fuel that kept workers productive for long hours. British demand for tea was bottomless, and on Earth, there was only one supplier, the Qing Empire. This was a textbook seller's market. China monopolized tea production technology and resources. Buying tea alone wasn't the problem. The problem was how to pay for it. At the time, global trade settled in only one form of hard currency, silver. The Qing emperors had zero interest in British wool textiles, cutlery, or pianos. Emperor Qianlong's famous line, quote, "The Celestial Empire possesses all things in abundance," unquote, translated commercially as, "Your products are worthless, we accept cash only." The result was Britain's nightmare, a massive trade deficit. Between 1710 and 1810, Britain shipped at least 26 million pounds sterling worth of silver to China to purchase tea and silk. If you were the East India Company's CFO, you would be sweating. Silver was hemorrhaging out of the economy like a severed artery. What flowed back was tea, a consumable asset that disappeared once drunk. In an era effectively governed by the silver standard, silver outflows meant shrinking money supply, deflation, and economic contraction. Simply put, Britain was drinking itself toward bankruptcy. The East India Company tried every legal solution. They attempted to sell Indian cotton, but failed. They tried British clocks, but aside from a few palace curiosities, no one could afford them. Against China's closed market, Britain's free trade ideology shattered on impact. By the 1820s, the East India Company faced an existential crisis. As a chartered joint stock company, it had to deliver massive annual dividends to the British government and investors. If the silver drain wasn't stopped, the imperial engine would stall. They needed a product with three features. Number one, high addictiveness, meaning lifelong repeat customers. Number two, high value to weight ratio, which is ideal for long-distance smuggling. And number three, it had to be impossible for China to produce independently. In Bengal, India, they looked across endless fields of poppies and smiled. If legal trade failed, illegal trade would replace it. If China didn't want British cloth, Britain would create a demand China couldn't refuse. Thus began the largest state-backed drug dumping operation in human history. In business textbooks, this is called vertical integration. The East India Company didn't merely buy opium, it industrialized it. In Bengal, the company established a total monopoly over opium production. Think of a modern pharmaceutical giant like Pfizer, except instead of vaccines, it produced death packed in wooden crates. First came upstream control. Indian farmers were forced into predatory loan contracts, compelled to replace food crops with poppies. The company was the only lender, the only buyer, This was classic debt trap economics. Next came processing and standardization, the company's true core competency. At massive factories in Patna and Gazipur, workers dried, blended, and molded opium into standardized 3-pound balls, sealed with the company's stamp and packed in mango leaves and custom crates. They launched branded lines, specifically Patna and Benares opium. Just as consumers today trust Coca-Cola's consistency, Chinese addicts trusted the East India Company's brand for purity and reliability. The brand premium was extraordinary. A chest of opium cost about 200 rupees to produce, sold for 600 to 800 rupees at Calcutta auction, and fetched several times more in China. Profit margins ranged from 400% to over 1,000%. This was virtually unmatched outside of outright robbery. But there was a legal problem. The East India Company represented the British Crown. Directly shipping narcotics into China violated Chinese law, and openly unloading opium in Canton would constitute an act of war. So the company's lawyers and accountants engineered a brilliant solution called risk outsourcing. The company did not ship opium to China. Instead, it auctioned opium in Calcutta to licensed private traders. Once the crates left company warehouses, legal responsibility vanished. The company washed its hands and claimed, "We sell agricultural products in India. What buyers do afterward is not our concern." This is known as plausible deniability, the ancestor of modern money laundering and proxy operations. Distribution fell to firms like Jardine, Matheson and Company. If the East India Company was the manufacturer, Jardine Matheson was the exclusive distributor and logistics provider. William Jardine, the legendary taipan, was effectively the cartel's COO. His system was flawless. First, offshore warehousing. British ships anchored at Linton Island outside Chinese jurisdiction. Floating warehouses loaded with opium sat permanently offshore. Second, last-mile delivery. High-speed Chinese smuggling boats, armed and fast, outran Qing patrol ships with ease. Third, customer acquisition cost. Bribes were operational expenses. Officials weren't fighting smuggling, they were shareholders in it. Sometimes Qing naval vessels even escorted opium shipments. By the 1830s, imports exploded. In 1820, 4,000 chests. By 1838, 40,000 chests. The trade balance reversed. Silver flooded back to Britain. China's economy bled. Silver scarcity doubled tax burdens on farmers. Corruption spread. Soldiers grew addicted, and social order unraveled. London, meanwhile, celebrated. Then came a man who didn't understand business rules, Lin Zexu. He wasn't here to negotiate. He came to liquidate a transnational drug syndicate. In March 1839, Lin arrived in Canton armed with intelligence. He knew suppliers, distributors, and inventory levels. His order was simple: surrender the opium or lose everything. When traders attempted their usual bribe tactics, Lin blockaded the foreign factories, cutting off food and water. 350 Western merchants were trapped. Panicking, British Trade Superintendent Charles Elliot made a historic decision. He promised, on behalf of the British government, to reimburse all losses. Debt was transferred. 20,283 chests were surrendered. At Human, 2.37 million pounds weight of opium were destroyed. This was worth over 2 million British pounds, nearly 4% of Britain's annual revenue. The British government refused to honor Elliot's promise unless someone else paid. William Jardine returned to London to lobby for war. He rebranded the narrative. There was silence on opium, but emphasis on free trade, protection of property rights, and national honor. Despite fierce opposition from figures like William Gladstone, Parliament passed the war budget by 9 votes. Britain sent a modern enforcement fleet. Its objectives were clear: collect debts, break trade barriers, and seize real estate, specifically Hong Kong. What arrived in China wasn't just a fleet, it was the Industrial Revolution. Steam-powered iron gunboats like HMS Nemesis obliterated Qing forces using obsolete technology. The British targeted China's economic lifeline, the Grand Canal. When it was cut, Beijing faced starvation. The Qing surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was a brutal debt restructuring. It demanded $21 million in indemnities, $6 million for destroyed opium, $3 million for merchant debts, and $12 million for British war costs. It demanded the cession of Hong Kong to be used as an offshore logistics and finance hub. It demanded 5 treaty ports, allowing deregulated market access. And finally, the loss of tariff autonomy. Notably, the word opium never appeared in the treaty, yet the trade expanded dramatically. Opium profits funded British imperial expansion and birthed modern finance. In 1865, HSBC was founded in Hong Kong and Shanghai, its board populated by opium traders. Firms like Jardine Matheson laundered their fortunes into respectable conglomerates. What ended the trade wasn't morality, it was import substitution. China began producing cheap domestic opium, profit margins collapsed. By the early 20th century, the trade ended because it was no longer profitable. Strip away nationalism and morality, and what remains is cold accounting. The Opium War proves that when profit margins rise high enough, capital will trample laws, manufacture wars, and redefine ethics. Empires are not driven by madness, but by spreadsheets. There are no civilized or barbaric nations, only winners and losers on the balance sheet. If you want to understand the world, remember this: follow the money.